The sun had barely risen when she saw him again, standing by the edge of the river as if he'd been waiting all along. The light spilled across the water in broken gold, catching on the wet stones and on the bare skin of his shoulders. He didn't move when she approached, didn't even turn to look at her until she was close enough to hear the sound of the river's current between them. There was something unreadable in his eyes, something that made her pulse skip in a way she hated to admit. She had met men before, many who stared too long, many who thought they knew her because they knew what they wanted. But he was different. With him, every glance felt measured, deliberate, and yet impossible to pin down. She had thought she understood men like him, proud, untamed, carrying the weight of a world that would never bend to another's will. She was wrong. The first time they crossed paths, she'd been gathering wild berries near the ridge, the distant beat of horse hooves breaking the quiet morning. She turned to find him watching from the saddle, a lone Apache, lean and still, as if carved from the land itself. He said nothing, just studied her with an intensity that felt heavier than words. It wasn't the stare of a stranger passing through it. It was the look of someone who had already decided something about her. She didn't know whether to feel challenged or afraid. Since that day, they had met more than once, always by chance, or so she tried to believe. He was never the first to speak, but when he did, his voice was deep and steady, carrying a weight that made her listen, whether she wanted to or not. Rumors about him traveled fast in the small settlement. Some called him dangerous. Others whispered that he was simply guarding the land, watching every outsider who dared cross it. She didn't know which version to believe. Still, there was a strange gravity to him, the kind that kept pulling her back into his path, no matter how much she told herself to keep her distance. And in those quiet moments between them, she sometimes caught his gaze lingering not with hunger, but with something else entirely, something she couldn't name. It was on the third meeting, by the old cottonwood tree near the creek, that she finally let her thoughts slip into words. She had seen the way his eyes followed her movements, how he'd sometimes step closer than necessary when handing her something. She told herself it was obvious he wanted her the way men wanted women, with that silent, unspoken claiming. So she said it plainly, without shame, her chin lifted. "I know why you look at me." She expected him to smirk, to let the truth settle between them like smoke. Instead, he just looked at her long, slow, as if weighing the worth of every breath she had ever taken. When he finally spoke, the words landed like stones in still water. "No," he said, his voice quiet but edged with certainty. "It's because you never beg." For a moment she didn't breathe, the meaning slipping just beyond her grasp. His gaze held hers, unblinking, and she felt the ground shift beneath her. She had been wrong completely, utterly wrong. This wasn't about desire in the way she'd imagined. It was about something deeper, something far more unsettling. She opened her mouth to ask him what he meant, but he had already stepped back. The faintest trace of a smile on his lips, as if he knew she would spend the nights ahead turning those words over in her mind, and she would. Because now, she wasn't just drawn to him, she was caught in something she didn't understand. Why did it matter to him that she never begged? What had he seen? What had he decided about her, and what would it cost her to find out? The river kept moving between them, carrying the sound of water and the promise of a truth that was not ready to be told. She tried to shrug his words off as a trick of the moment, something said to confuse her. But they followed her home like footsteps in the dusk. That night she lay awake listening to the wind move across the roof, the old boards creak and settle, the steady breath of the house that had kept her for years. The phrase kept circling back. "It's because you never beg." She tested it in her mind the way you test a sore tooth, pressing, pulling away, pressing again, waiting for the ache. She remembered every time she had stood her ground, Every time she had spoken when silence might have been easier, and the way people reacted when a woman did not duck her head. Maybe he had seen that from the first moment. Maybe that was why. His gaze felt like a quiet measure, not a claim dot by morning the settlement was already moving. Smoke rose from the chimneys. A boy ran by chasing a runaway hat, laughter trailing behind him. She walked to the storehouse to trade and heard the usual talk weather, pasture, a wagon wheel that cracked on the ridge trail, when his name came. Up, the voices dropped, more breath and sound. Some said the Apache rider dealt in warnings. Others said he kept peace by letting everyone know he was near. People like to make a story simple so they can pack it away and move on, but real stories don't fold like that. They keep a corner out, snagging you as you pass. She kept to her tasks until the sun climbed high, then took a basket and walked. Out beyond the fence line, she told herself she needed herbs from the shaded banks of the creek. She told herself she wasn't looking for him. She also told herself not to practice what she'd say if he appeared. But the words lined up anyway, restless and bright, as if their sound alone could make sense of all the quiet between them. The creek ran with late summer patience, clear enough to show the small stones scattered on its bed. Dragonflies hovered, light flashing on their wings. She knelt to cut mint and yarrow, the familiar scent grounding her, and for a moment she forgot to look up. When she did, she saw hoof prints at the water's edge, not fresh but not washed away either. He had been here. The thought tightened. Something in her chest, a thread she could not name. The first time she came to this land, it felt like the wind itself had been cut from the hills and handed to her. She arrived with a trunk, a letter of promise, and a plan that already had too many holes. The settlement was smaller than 24 roofs, a rough schoolroom, a clapboard church that doubled as a hall. She learned the place by walking it. She learned the work by doing it badly until she could do it well. She learned to read the sky, to hear trouble in a new silence. The people were a mix of tired hope and stubborn will. Some could talk about nothing but what they left behind. Others acted as if the past had burned clean and only the future mattered. She found her place between them, not asking for more than the day gave, not asking for less. If anyone asked why she stayed when the nearest city meant better roads and a softer life, she gave them a half smile and said the land had decided. It wasn't a joke. The land did decide things. It decided where water ran and where it hid. It decided who could live with the long distances and who could not. It decided how silence felt, whether it was the good kind that wrapped you up or the sharp kind that kept you alert. Maybe he, too, was decided by this place more than by any story others tried to place on him. 2 days passed before she saw him again. The air was thick with heat, clouds piling on the horizon like a plan the sky hadn't agreed to share. She had taken the ridge trail to look out over the valley to see if any storms were forming that might break the dry spell. He was there when she reached the top, not on horseback this time, but standing with his back to her, arms loose at his sides, as if he had set his body to match the wind. She thought of turning around, of leaving before he knew she had come. Instead, she said his name only. She didn't have one for him. People used words for him that were not names, words that were more about themselves. So she cleared her throat and spoke in the way you do when you want to be seen without pretending. I have a question. He didn't turn right away. Then he did, face steady, eyes clear, the hint of a nod giving her permission to go on. She took a breath. What did you mean by what you said at the creek? His mouth twitched as if the answer belonged to the wind and he was deciding whether to hand it over. You think I follow you because your body is afire, he said, unhurried, as if each word had weight. Many men follow fire. That is not hard to understand. I watch because you do not trade your voice for safety. Most people do. They give it away a handful at a time. She felt the shape of his meaning then, not the edges but the center. "So that is worthy to you," she said softly, half to herself. "A person who does not beg. It is rare," he replied. "Rare things must be guarded. Guarded." The word turned in her mind, catching on motes of memory. She looked over the valley, where the river cut a bright thread and the cottonwoods gathered like a promise. "And what would you guard me from?" she asked. "The people here? The land? Yourself?" He watched her without blinking, and for a moment she thought she had pressed too hard. "From bargains you cannot keep," he said at last. "From men who make a cage from praise. From any force that would say your worth depends on asking for permission." She stood in that, feeling its truth rise like heat from the stones. In the settlement, praise often came with a rope attached. Good girl, good helper, good listener. Tug the rope and her world would tilt. The men who liked her independence until it cost them a decision. The women who warned her that being difficult wasn't a future. She had built her life anyway. Maybe he saw that. Maybe he saw something else she could not bear to name. Thunder murmured, far off. He tilted his head as if listening to a story that began beyond the hills. "There will be wind," he said. "You should be below the ridge by evening." "You say that like you will not be here when the storm comes," she said. "I will be where the wind asks me to be." He gave her a look that felt like a quiet agreement and stepped away. She wanted to ask him to stay, to stand beside her. As the air shifted, to tell her more, she did not. She held her tongue as a choice, not a surrender. And as he disappeared into the folds of the land, she realized she understood one more piece of his first answer. To never beg did not mean to never ask. It meant to ask without bending your shape to fit a smaller box. It meant to keep your own borders even when the world pushed. When the storm finally came, it came from two directions at once, wind twisting the treetops, rain arriving like a decision. She reached home before the first strike of lightning, fastened the shutters, and sat in the dim light with a book open and unread on her knees. The roof drummed with rain. The yard blurred into motion. Somewhere out there he rode or walked or stood or waited. She imagined him under the cottonwoods, rain threading down his hair, hands open, eyes on the far line where the clouds met. The land. She told herself not to think like that. She thought like that anyway. In the morning the storm had passed, leaving the ground rinsed and bright. But something else had moved with it, a rumor that arrived in broken pieces through the day. A rancher found a sign at the far fence. Another family heard whistles in the night, 3 notes repeating. A small circle of stones appeared at the edge of the road, and no one could agree whether it meant warning or welcome. Some blamed the Apache band to the north. Others thought of drifters who used fear to ease their hand. The talk grew louder than the facts. Fear has a way of doing that. She listened and kept her face still, though her stomach tightened when 2 men began to speak of riding out, of settling the air. Words like that make the land itself go quiet. She walked to the creek at noon, because she always did on days when the town turned into a kettle with the lid set askew. The water was higher, grass flattened where the surge had been. On the far bank, lodged between 2 roots, she found a small carved token, a piece of wood rubbed smooth, a symbol, cut into it like a stitched path. She didn't know its meaning, but when she turned it in her hand, she thought of patterns you only see from a distance. She looked up and caught a flicker of movement in the trees, a shape that could have been a deer or a human shadow. Her pulse spiked. She called out a single word, nothing that meant hello, nothing that meant stay away. Just a sound that offered notice without claim. The trees held their breath. Then the shadow slipped deeper, leaving only the layered quiet of summer. The days that followed stacked themselves like cards, ordinary chores holding secrets in their sleeves. She taught the morning class in the small schoolroom, chalk clacking. Against the slate, children tracing letters with tongues just peeking between their teeth. She fixed a roof seam. She bartered a jar of preserves for a length of twine. She slept in short bursts and woke to the echo of a voice telling her that rare things must be guarded. When she returned to the creek on the fourth day, she found hoof prints again, this time fresh enough that a little water still shivered in them. He had been here within the hour. She waited. The sun stumbled toward late afternoon. A hawk drifted, then vanished into a pocket of sky. When the sound came, it was not hoofbeats but the soft susurration of grass parting. He stepped out from behind the cottonwood with that same unhurried ease, as if he had always been part of the day and only now decided to be seen. Her first thought was not what to say, but what not to say. She folded her hands to keep them from betraying her, then let them go. "You left something," she said, and held out the carved token. He took it without letting their fingers touch, a courtesy that felt like respect rather than distance. "It is not mine," he said. "It was meant for you to find." "Meant? By who?" "Those who watch the edges," he said. "Not my people." "Not yours. The kind who live in the space between and feed on fear." Her throat tightened. "What does it mean?" "That they are counting," he said. "Counting what belongs to whom. Testing how loud the settlement will shout if pushed. They are not the storm. They are the wind that looks like a storm from far away." "And you?" she asked. "Where do you stand in this?" He looked past her to the water, the way a person looks at a question they have answered 100 times and will answer 100 more. "I stand where I have always stood," he said, "between the lines that should not be crossed and the people who cannot see them. Why tell me?" The question slipped out before she could weigh it. "Because you listen without selling the listening," he said. "Because if I warn the men who like to ride out, they will turn the warning into a hunt. Because you will carry the message in a way that does not make the ground bleed." She let the weight of that land on her shoulders. "A message like a living thing, delicate but necessary." "What should I say?" she asked. "Say that noise calls noise," he said. "Say that we must hold still long enough to learn what the mark truly asks. Say that if someone rides at the wrong hour with anger in his hands, the wind will take it as an invite." She nodded, though her heart was doing a fast staccato dance. "Will they listen?" "They will hear," he said. "Listening is harder." The ghost of a smile crossed his face, the kind that softened nothing and hid nothing either. She wanted to ask more about the symbol on the token, about the whistles, about the space between his people and hers that everyone pretended to understand. She wanted to ask what he guarded about himself, what bargain he had refused, what vow kept his shoulders square. She asked none of it, not yet. Instead she said, "If they do not listen, what then?" He slid the token into a small pouch at his belt. "Then rare things must guard themselves," he said quietly. "And some people must stand in places that will not keep them safe." The river kept moving between them, tireless and indifferent. She felt the cliff edge again, the one she had reached when he first told her it was not desire that pulled his gaze, but something harsher and more honest. She thought of the settlement with its bright rooms and sharp corners, of the road signs only fear can read, of the men testing the weight of their rifles as if steel could measure rightness. She thought of what it would mean to be a person who never begged and never bowed and still asked for what mattered. She thought of him on the far side of all those thoughts, waiting because waiting is sometimes the only way to hold a line. "Walk with me," she said. It was not a command and not a plea. It was an invitation shaped like a path. He did not move at first. Then he stepped into pace beside her, not too close, not distant. Both of them following the creek as it curved toward the place where the cottonwoods opened into a field of tall grass. The light dropped into gold. Crickets started their evening call. At the edge of the grass he stopped. "This is where I leave you," he said. "Will I see you tomorrow?" She asked, hating the hope in her voice, loving it anyway. "Tomorrow will decide," he said. "The wind is not done speaking." She watched him go until the grass swallowed his shape. She stood a long while after, listening to the world settle into night, feeling the weight of the message in her chest and the echo of a promise that was not a promise. When she turned back toward home, the sky had gone the color of embered ash, and the first star was holding itself very still, as if it, too, was waiting for someone to make the next right move. The next morning she woke before the first light, a habit born from years of needing to meet the day before it could meet her. The air was cool, touched by the damp memory of last night's rain, and the sky held that thin gray hue that came just before dawn. She brewed coffee, though she barely tasted it, her thoughts already walking the lines he had drawn in their last conversation. The token sat on her table, though he had taken the original with him. She had carved a copy late the night before, not for its meaning, but for the shape of it, lines and curves she could trace when her mind ran too far ahead. It reminded her that the symbol's weight wasn't in what she understood, but in what she didn't. The settlement was quieter than usual. People kept to themselves, speaking in short bursts, as though the wind itself might carry their words farther than they intended. She noticed the way men lingered near the livery, the way rifles leaned against the wall as though waiting for hands that hadn't yet decided to use them. The schoolhouse felt different, too. The children still laughed, but it was the high, quick kind of laughter that came when they knew the grown-ups were uneasy. She taught the morning lessons, but her mind stayed half on the doorway, half on the thought of him riding somewhere along the edges, keeping watch without making himself a shadow in their streets. By midday she had heard 3 versions of the latest trouble. One claimed cattle had been found with their brands scraped away, a sure sign of theft. Another swore there had been a fire started deliberately in the far pasture, though it burned itself out before reaching the fence. The third version was stranger, a claim that a figure had been seen near the ridge, carrying a torch but walking without sound. No one could agree on which direction it had gone. She knew better than to treat any single telling as the truth, but all of them shared the same root. Someone wanted to stir the settlement, and someone else was watching to see how high the dust would rise. That evening she walked beyond the creek, past the cottonwoods and into the low hills where the grass brushed her waist. The air smelled faintly of smoke, though no plume marked the sky. She thought of his words, noise calls noise, and wondered if the settlement had already answered too loudly. She found herself scanning the horizon without meaning to, looking for the shape of a rider, for the glint of sunlight off something that shouldn't be there. Every now and then she imagined she saw movement, but it was always the wind bending the grass or the flash of a bird's wing dot. It was nearly dark when she turned back, and that was when she heard it, a whistle, 3 short notes, repeated once. It came from somewhere to her right, just beyond a small rise. She froze, the sound threading into her bones. The notes weren't rushed, and they didn't sound like any bird she knew. She didn't call out. Instead, she crouched low, letting the grass hide her as she edged closer to the rise. When she reached it, the whistling stopped. She waited, heart pounding in her ears, until a figure appeared at the crest, not him, but another man, taller, with a wide-brimmed hat pulled low and a coat that hung heavy despite the warmth. He didn't see her. He stood there for a moment, scanning the valley, then turned and walked away, disappearing into the dim light. She stayed hidden until she was sure he was gone. When she reached home, the air inside felt close and heavy. She lit a lamp, though she kept it low, and sat with her back to the wall. She didn't know the man she'd seen, but his presence near. The creek meant the trouble was closer than the settlement guessed. She thought of telling someone, but the image of rifles leaning by the livery came back to her. If she spoke, They might ride out in anger, and anger was exactly what someone wanted. She could hear his voice in her mind. If the wrong man rides, with anger in his hands, the wind will take it as an invite. She wasn't ready to hand the wind that kind of power. 2 days passed before she saw him again, and when she did, it was under the kind of light that made everything sharper. He came down the slope toward her, his horse stepping carefully over loose stones. He didn't speak right away, just studied her as if he could see the weight she carried in her shoulders. "You've seen something," he said finally. She told him about the whistle, about the man on the rise. His face didn't change, but his eyes narrowed slightly. "That is not one of mine," he said. "Not one of yours either." "Then whose?" she asked. "The ones who live between," he replied, the same words he'd used before. "They do not plant. They do not keep. They only test the fences of others." He looked toward the creek as if it might answer him. "They have decided. This place is worth testing." "And if the settlement decides to fight?" she asked. "They will win the first fight," he said, "and lose what comes after. That is how these things work." He was silent for a moment, then added, "You must keep them from riding out." "Why me?" "Because they will not listen to me," he said simply. "And because you know the difference between stillness and doing nothing." The way he said it felt like both a warning and a trust, and she wasn't sure which one carried more weight. She thought of the people in town, of their unease building into something sharper. She thought of the man on the ridge and the sound of that whistle. And she thought of the space between the world she knew and the one he walked in, and how thin that space was becoming. That night the wind rose again, carrying the smell of rain that never came. She lay awake listening to it press against the house, wondering if he was out there, watching the same sky, listening for the same 3 notes. She knew the conflict was no longer just between the settlement and whoever tested its borders. It was between the need to act and the danger of acting too soon, between trust and the sharp edge of doubt. Somewhere in that space she would have to stand, and she knew, even before sleep finally took her, that standing there would come at a cost she could not yet name. The days that followed pressed in like a storm you could feel but not yet see. Every conversation in the settlement seemed to circle the same unspoken center. Something was coming, and no one agreed on what to do about it. The air felt charged, like a match waiting for a spark. Men gathered in tight groups near the livery in the store, speaking low but glancing over their shoulders. Women carried on with their work, but their eyes stayed on the horizon more than the task in their hands. Even the children had grown quieter, as if they sensed the ground shifting beneath the routines they knew. She moved between them, listening without making herself a part of any one discussion. Each story she overheard was sharper than the last. Someone swore the whistles had been heard again near the north pasture. Another said tracks had been found too close to the main well. One man claimed he'd seen a shadow moving in the grass long after the moon had risen. None of these tales could be proved, but each added another stone to the pile of unease. And each time she thought of telling them about the man on the ridge, she remembered his warning call's noise. On the 3rd evening, as the sun was pulling itself down behind the hills, she found him waiting for her by the cottonwoods. He was leaning against his horse, arms crossed, the expression on his face unreadable. "They are getting ready," he said without preamble. She didn't need to ask who he meant. "If they ride tonight," he went on, "the ones between will give them something to find. And then the first fight will be theirs, but not the last. They won't listen to me," she said quietly. "Not all of them. Some already think I speak too carefully, like I'm afraid to take a side. Then speak to the ones who will listen," he replied. "Enough to slow the rest. Sometimes you only need one hand on the reins to keep the horse from running wild." His calm unsettled her more than any raised voice could have. She wanted to ask what he would do if the settlement rode out anyway, but she didn't. instead. She told him about the tension in the town, the way every eye seemed to be measuring the distance between safety and risk. He listened without interrupting, his gaze fixed on some point beyond her shoulder, as if he could already see the path events would take. That night, she went to the meeting hall where a dozen of the settlers had gathered. The air inside was thick, with the heat of bodies and the smell of dust tracked in from outside. They were arguing about whether to send a group to patrol the ridge, whether to confront whoever was marking the land. She waited until the noise swelled enough that her voice would cut clean through. "If you go now," she said, "you will be walking into someone else's plan. You'll think you're chasing them, but they'll be leading you." A few turned to look at her, frowning. One man snorted, "And what's your plan?" "Sit here while they take our land apart piece by piece?" "My plan is not to give them what they want," she said, steady. "They're watching how quickly you'll act without knowing what you're acting on. They're counting on anger to make the choice for you." The room shifted. Some looked away. Others studied her with a suspicion she'd felt before, the kind that said they were weighing whether her voice belonged here. She held her ground, not raising it, not softening it. "If you ride out tonight, you'll be answering a call you don't understand. And the answer will cost more than the question." When she left, the night air was cooler, but it carried the hum of tension that wouldn't break. She didn't know if she had slowed them or only delayed what they'd already decided. She walked back toward her home, every sound in the dark. Suddenly louder the rustle of grass, the distant call of an owl, the shift of something heavy in the brush. Halfway there, she saw movement ahead. A figure stood in the middle of the path, the moonlight glinting faintly on something in his hand. For a moment, her breath caught it wasn't him. The hat, the coat, the heavy stance, it was the man she'd seen on the ridge. He didn't move. As she approached, and when she stopped a few yards away, the whistle cut the air again, low and deliberate. 3 notes. Then silence. Neither of them spoke. The space between them felt stretched tight, like a rope that might snap with the smallest pull. She thought of running, but running would turn her back on him, and that felt wrong. Instead, she took one step forward. His head tilted slightly, as though marking the choice. Then, without a word, he stepped off the path and melted into the dark. Her pulse was still hammering when she reached her door. She didn't sleep, not even when the first pale wash of dawn crept into the room. Instead, she sat by the window, waiting for a shape to appear on the horizon, his, not the other man's. She needed to tell him what had happened. She needed to know if it meant what she feared it did. When he came, it was late morning. He saw her waiting and swung down from his horse without speaking. She told him about the man blocking her path, about the whistle, about the way he'd simply stepped aside and vanished. His jaw tightened. "That was not a warning," he said. "That was a mark. He's telling you they've chosen their time." A cold shiver ran through her. "Then when?" "Soon," he said. "Before the moon changes." And as he looked toward the hills, she realized they were standing at the very edge of what could still be held back. One wrong move now, and the wind would carry everything away. The days that followed passed in a kind of measured waiting, like the air just before a storm breaks. Every sound felt sharper, every shadow heavier. The settlement stayed restless. Men keeping their rifles close, women glancing at the horizon with quick, careful eyes. She kept to her work but moved through it with a constant watchfulness, her thoughts circling the man on the ridge and the whistle that had cut through the night. She knew the next move would decide everything, not just for her, but for everyone. Who called this place home? He came to her at dusk 2 days later. The sun had dipped low, setting the sky in a wash of deep orange and rose, and the cottonwoods stood like dark sentinels against it. He dismounted without a word, his face calm but shadowed with something heavier than worry. "It will be tonight," he said. "They've marked the edge of the pasture. If your people ride out now, they'll meet them in the open. That is what they want." Her pulse quickened. "Then what do we do?" "You will speak to them," he said simply. "Not as someone asking, as someone telling. There is no time for them to decide by vote or argument. They must hear you and stop." "They won't listen," she said, though even as she spoke, she knew it wasn't entirely true. Some would? "Enough, maybe. They will listen," he said, his gaze holding hers. "Because you have never begged, and because they know you do not waste words." She didn't ask how he knew that. She only nodded and left him there in the shadow of the trees, walking quickly toward the meeting hall. By the time she arrived, a small group of men were already gathered, saddles over their shoulders, lanterns lit, the air buzzing with the energy of people on the edge of action. She stepped into their circle without hesitation. "If you ride." "Out now," she said, her voice carrying into the stillness. "You'll be walking into a fight they've chosen, not you. They want you angry. They want you to come. And when you do, they'll make sure the first shot is theirs to tell about." A few bristled, but no one spoke over her. She went on. "You can protect what's yours without giving them what they want. Wait until they show themselves here, where you know the ground. Make them choose whether they truly want to face you without their tricks." The oldest of the group, a man who rarely wasted breath on talk, finally nodded. "We hold," he said quietly. And just like that, the tension began to shift. Not dissolve, never that, but turn into something steadier. Less like a spark waiting for dry grass and more like a flame, kept in a controlled hearth. She stepped outside into the cooling night, relief and doubt tangling in her chest. He was there, standing just beyond the light of the lanterns, watching. "They've agreed to wait," she told him. "That is enough," he said. "The ones between will not come if the trap does not spring. They will drift away to some other place where the ground is easier to shake." And he was right. In the days that followed, the whistles stopped. No more tracks appeared near the well. The man on the ridge was not seen again. Whatever plan had been forming seemed to dissolve back into the empty spaces it had come from. The settlement slowly loosened its shoulders, though the rifles stayed close, and the conversations turned back to weather, crops, and repairs. When she next saw him, it was by the creek. The water ran low now, the heat pressing down on the land, but the air between them felt easier. "So it's over," she said, though she didn't entirely believe her own words. "For now," he replied, "there is always another test, another fence to measure. But this one you passed." She studied him for a moment, thinking back to the first time he'd spoken to her, to the words that had unsettled her more than any threat could have. "When you said it was because I never beg," she asked, "was this what you meant? That I would stand my ground when it mattered?" A faint smile touched his mouth. "That is part of it. But it is also that you do not trade yourself away to be liked or safe or given what you already deserve. That is rarer than you think." She felt the truth of it settle inside her, not as pride, but as something quieter and steadier. It wasn't about never asking for help, or never bending when it was right to bend. It was about knowing the worth of your own voice, and refusing to hand it over to anyone who would use it against you. The creek gurgled softly between them, carrying the late summer heat toward the distant valley. He stepped back, the way he always did when it was time to leave, and for the first time she felt no need to ask if she'd see him again. Some people were part of the land itself. You didn't need to see them to know they were there. Weeks later, when autumn began to slip its first cool breath over the hills, she thought often of the way the tension had nearly broken the settlement apart. She thought of the man on the ridge and the way fear had almost pushed her neighbors into someone else's trap. And she thought of him, how he had stood on the edges, neither claiming her nor letting her stand alone, guiding her without ever stepping into the space where she had to choose for herself. The whispers about him never stopped in the settlement. Some called him a guardian, others a threat. She didn't correct them either way. Let them make their stories. She knew the truth didn't belong to them. It belonged to the moments no one else had seen, the stillness before the choice, the quiet between two people who understood that not all battles were won with noise. One evening, as the last light bled out of the sky, she returned to the cottonwoods and found a small carved token on the ground where she had first met him. This one carried a different Mark II crossing lines with a single curve running through them. She didn't know the meaning, but she didn't need to. She understood it was not a warning this time, but a message, a reminder. Rare things must be guarded. She slipped it into her pocket and stood a while longer, listening to the wind move through the leaves. The land felt steady. Again, but she knew it could change with a single step from someone who didn't understand it. That was the way of things. Still, she smiled. Because now she knew she had the patience to hold her ground, and the strength to do it without begging for the right to stand there. When she finally turned for home, the path ahead was quiet, but it no longer felt empty. Somewhere she knew he was out there, watching the lines that should not be crossed. And she understood now that his presence had never been about desire in the way she first thought it had been about recognition. Two people who could see the shape of each other's resolve and knew that some connections didn't need to be named to be real. The wind shifted, carrying the faintest scent of rain, and she breathed it in like a promise. Whatever came next, be it trouble or peace, she would meet it the same way she had met him, steady, unflinching, and without giving away what made her hers. The creek would keep running, the hills would keep standing, and she would keep walking the fine line between stillness and action. And somewhere beyond the ridge, in the wide space between shadow and light, she knew he was doing the same.